There we go. Awesome. For just before we get started with actual content type stuff, I have a new recording setup. So theoretically, the audio quality should be a lot better. And now I don't have to haul around a giant professional microphone. So that's nice. I'm excited for that. I also posted some details for our second midterm today. It's all summarized here, but I'm just going to go over it verbally since we're together. But this semester's been a little bit chaotic between getting moved online for 2 weeks exactly in time for the first midterm, and now we're back in person, and there's sort of lots of moving pieces. So I wanted to put together just a whole outline of what to expect, what's going on. And when I was designing this course, I was on the fence about how I was going to do the exams, because when I switched to fully online, I was doing open book tests for everything because I don't like proctoring, which is how we did our online midterm. So I had been kind of wavering on, do I want to include that in in-person tests or in in-person classes? And I said yes for my first year classes, and I still wasn't sure here. But since we had our first midterm online with open book, I figured I'd keep that into this midterm as well. So even though it's in person now because classes are in person, I'm still holding on to that open book policy. The only difference is you won't have access to a computer. You'll just have sort of hard copies. So if you wanted to print out like a cheat sheet with all of the important information that you want to have at hand for the exam, that is acceptable according to these rules. So that's my big change. Because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to approach it, but I really do like the idea of open book, especially with how I test, where I don't love going after you guys for definitions. I'd rather you show me that you understand a concept. So if you have access to definitions, that just makes it that much more easy, and lets me test what I'm trying to test, which is the goal there. But for all of the details here, just the quick summary of what's sent to your inbox and what's on Moodle is that it's next Tuesday. It will be in class. It will be 75 minutes long because that's the full class duration. So that's actually technically 5 minutes longer than what we had for online. I kept the number of questions the same, even though we have some extra time, just because I find with the in-person classes, it's nice to have the extra. So still 50 multiple choice, 5 short answer. We're going to be doing all of the new chapters, so everything from 4 to 6, so up until today, because we should finish chapter 6 today. I'm going to start chapter 8 on Thursday just because we have the time, but we're not going to test on that. That's going to be for the final. And yeah, so anything that you have a hard copy of, so if you want to have like a textbook or your notes or whatever handy for the exam, you are allowed to do that. Just no laptops. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So today we should finish up chapter 6. So that should be everything. And that's going to line up with our syllabus, actually. I wasn't quite sure how long this chapter was going to take us, so I gave us a little bit of wiggle room. But the hope is that we'll be able to finish that up. Okay, so yeah, so that's the midterm stuff. If you have any questions about that, let me know. If you think of any right now, we can go over that now too. But hopefully that's pretty straightforward. And I try to write stuff out and like why I do stuff just so you guys see what's going on in my mind. Okay, so that was the announcement stuff that I wanted to cover. Yeah. So I guess we're going to hop over, and we had just finished talking about sort of some of these different things that are involved in controlling hunger and regulating sort of how much weight we hold on to or get rid of, depending. So we had looked at all these different stimuli. We had our glucose and fatty acid levels. We had the things that influence those levels, the chemicals that make us feel hungry or full, and so on and so forth, with this really fancy smancy graph or table that gives us that nice summary of everything, which I guess that table might look good on, say, a cheat sheet for an exam or something. But next we're going to move on and start talking about obesity and sort of some of the things that can contribute to that. So we've probably heard quite often about the rising rates of obesity in the world. And in the last couple of decades, those numbers have they're saying here that since the 1970s, we've had a 9 times increase in obesity rates in men. I'm assuming that's just in the US because that's what our textbooks tend to focus on. But that's a pretty big jump in obesity in that time frame. It's not as intense in children, but it's still a pretty dramatic increase. And we've probably heard over and over again that the fact that there are so many more people who are obese, we're having lots of issues with health. So it's sort of costly for healthcare terms. It's hard on individuals who are overweight, who have to deal with sort of all the health concerns that come with that. And so it is a large and a growing problem. There are still issues where there is a significant proportion of the population in the world that are underweight due to, say, lack of resources or no access to food and things like that. And it's kind of an interesting disparity here. When they're stating the facts in the textbook, they talk about the fact that we're having more people who fall into that overweight category. We're having less people who are in sort of the underweight category, but then we have more again who fall under the category of malnourished, where they don't have enough access to food. So we're seeing this push to the extremes where there are fewer people in the middle, and we're having sort of massive explosions in terms of populations at either extreme. And most of what they're using to quantify these, to collect data on this, is something called the body mass index. And it's sort of a numerical quantifier of how lean or obese an individual is. And they use a person's weight and their height in order to get this sort of ratio. And there's, of course, lots of controversy around using BMI as a measurement. It's kind of deceptive. There's some really interesting graphics that go around on like Instagram and Facebook that show a whole bunch of different people who all have the same BMI, but who have very different builds, and some of them look a lot heavier than others. They might be the exact same BMI, but it isn't necessarily represented in what we see for them. So it's one of those measures that it should theoretically be fairly consistent, but there are issues with it. But besides that, that's one of the more reliable things, especially where, say, taking a straight measurement of weight isn't necessarily very reliable because people are taller and shorter. BMI doesn't necessarily take into account the fact that some people tend to be broader than others. So some people, like myself, are very broad-shouldered. So we tend to have a lot more weight on our frames just because we are larger-boned people. So there's sort of other dimensions that aren't taken into account here, but it's better than straight weight or something like that. But just keep some of those in mind while we're talking about BMI and our classification of obesity. Yep. Probably. It's interesting because BMI is still like the accepted standard. Everyone calculates it, even with the COVID vaccine. At the beginning, if you were in sort of a high-risk group, if your BMI was over a certain amount, and it's still being used as sort of a cutoff, a standard for literally everything, but it's not very accurate. And I find it very interesting to just have conversations with people about it, because I have quite a few friends who they're like, oh yeah, no, I count as obese on this chart, but looking at them, you wouldn't assume that. So I don't know, it's one of those flawed ideas, but yeah, I think something that takes into account sort of breadth as well as height as well as weight is a much better measure of it. But yeah, it's kind of hard to kind of get us a one number that gives us all of the dimensionality of a human being. Maybe volume would be a better one, but I don't know how we would do that. But yeah, so I guess the controversies of BMI aside, when we start looking at sort of people who tend to score fairly high on BMI, once they're into that category of overweight or beyond that into obese, then we start seeing some of those other factors, those risks that I had mentioned a little bit earlier on. So there are increased health risks associated with being overweight. There's a increased risk of diabetes. There's increased likelihood of high blood pressure and heart disease and stroke and different kinds of cancer. There's sort of some associative studies looking at being overweight and being more likely to develop Alzheimer's and other kinds of cognitive decline, which is interesting. But we need to keep in mind, again, that a lot of these are going to be correlational studies, not necessarily causal determinants. So it might be that people who are less mentally active also tend to be less fit and also tend to have faster cognitive decline. But still interesting that it correlates so strongly with so many negative health effects. So it is something that's pretty intense, and as I said, it affects the individuals who are affected by it, but also the healthcare system and sort of the whole system in general. So it's a pretty broad issue. So increased healthcare costs, reduced quality of life, even reduced life expectancy. So the more on that obese scale you are, the sort of lesser your life expectancy overall. So it's a big thing. But the interesting part that we're going to care most about here is the fact that obesity isn't necessarily something that we can point to a single cause. So it isn't just lack of impulse control. It's not because people are eating all the time and they can't stop themselves. It's not that inability to delay gratification. And most times it's not even a maladaptive eating style. Like there are, of course, factors like the availability of very calorie-rich foods very simply. So it's very easy to have fast food all the time. It's very easy to have multiple meals because of how things are set up. But it isn't the only thing that's driving this increase in obesity. There are other things that are sort of going on in the background. Okay, and I just want to make sure I get everything from my notes there. Okay. Perfect. So our next slide actually covers what I was going to go on into saying, so I'm just going to say it on this slide. So in that idea of there are other things other than just sort of lack of impulse control or eating too much or eating poorly, there's also some genetics associated with it. And again, we have that issue where a lot of the studies that look at obesity and heritability of obesity, they're confounded by a lot of the constructs of a family unit. So the same issues that we talked about when looking at, say, adoption and twin studies, where if somebody is raised with their family, they share both an environment and DNA. So it gets really difficult to separate out which are environmental factors influencing obesity and which ones are genetic factors. But in the studies that have been able to kind of pick that apart, whether it's adoption studies and we look at individuals raised separate from their biological family, or if we get even further than that and look at twin studies, we do see that there are genetic components to obesity above and beyond what we see in environmental factors. So there's both involved. It's not just one or the other. It's both. So when we're looking at our environmental influences, we've already mentioned the fact that there is an increased availability of food. So we have fast food. It is convenient, it is relatively low cost, and it's pretty much everywhere. So it's very easy to get in the habit of stopping somewhere on your way, somewhere in your busy life, and grabbing a burger and fries. So that can make it sort of convenient and easy because you're at least eating, but it's not the best food. We also have issues like a lot more people are driving rather than walking because most cities aren't set up well to deal with pedestrians. So we have sort of more sedentary lifestyles, especially with our move to online. I don't know about you guys, but I spent a lot of time sitting at home in front of my computer because I was teaching classes online. So I had days where I would track my steps and I'd hit maybe 500 steps in a whole day. And that's almost nothing. So all of these things lead us to not burn a lot of energy, but also take in a lot of calories. And of course, that's going to lead us to having more sort of nutrients, more fat stores, more anything than we can actually end up burning. And if we think back to those those biological processes where we're sort of using up the available glucose, we're storing some of it for later, and then we're picking up from our stores when we're in our fasting mode. If we're biasing towards eating more than we're burning, we're going to keep storing that away. So we're going to build up those fat stores. We're going to build up sort of waiting glucose. And if we're not burning it fast enough, it's just going to keep building up. So that's sort of one of the factors that's going on there. Another one that we don't necessarily think about is the fact that sleep deprivation can lead to weight gain. So as you sort of avoid sleeping, you end up sort of having a higher risk of obesity. And it's not just at the time. So it's not just that while you're a college student and you're not sleeping a whole heck of a lot, you tend to gain weight. It's also that even as an adolescent, if you don't sleep enough, you are then at higher risk of being obese in the future. So it's something formative. So it's kind of interesting that that can go on. And even infections can lead to obesity as well. Yep. So I don't know about the long-term effects of it. Like short-term, when I think about it, it's if you're not sleeping enough, then your body's not functioning optimally. So you might just not be storing and retrieving nutrients optimally. Maybe you're biased towards storing or whatever. It might also be that it does something to your eating habits. I know that for myself, if I don't sleep, I tend to snack more because I'm trying to keep going. So I end up consuming more calories, which would then end up stored more. That's sort of my idea of it. In terms of sort of the longer term stuff, this is just speculation because I don't think the text went into it too much. But sort of as an adolescent or as a child, you're sleeping a lot. And actually, as we're younger, we sleep more. So it starts when we're infants, when we sleep like 16 plus hours a day. And then even when we're sort of children and teenagers, we're supposed to be sleeping like 9, 10, 12 hours a day. And it isn't until we're adults where it drops down to 8 hours a day. And then when we're older, when we fall under the category of elderly, that's when we would have like 6 hours a day. So as we go through life, we need sort of less and less sleep. But if you don't get enough sleep, it can interfere with sort of that fundamental formation of your body and especially your brain. So it might mess with some of the pathways that are forming, especially the ones that control and regulate, like hunger and fat burning and switching between our fasting and non-fasting modes. So that's kind of where I would think about for longer term implications. But yeah, mostly just speculation. Okay, so those are all environmental things. Those are all factors that come from, say, society or our home lives or not sleeping well as a child or whatever. But as we said, there are also really strong genetic influences. And so when we look at those adoption studies, we see a pretty decent correlation between adopted children having obesity if their biological parents have obesity. There's still going to be a little bit of correlation depending on their home lives, because sometimes if you were raised by a family that is obese, they are obese because of eating habits, and then their children eat the same way. But it's actually a much stronger link with their genetic parents, their biological parents, as opposed to their environment environment or their adoptive parents. So that's an interesting one. And even if we look at sort of the differences between identical and fraternal twins in twin studies, we see that our identical twins, the ones that share 100% of their genetic code, they have a correlation of their BMIs of about 0.74, which is a pretty strong positive correlation. So that means if one twin is obese, then the other is very likely to also be obese. And that correlation drops off with fraternal twins, are twins that only share 50% of their genetics. So the more genetically similar they are, the more likely they are to be similar in weight. So lots of factors pointing to, yes, there is a genetic component. And so, of course, then everybody starts looking for an obesity gene. What gene is it that causes this to happen? And in humans, we don't necessarily have a specific spot that we can point to in our genome that says this is the one thing that causes obesity. It's a lot more complex than that. But we do have one gene that we call the obesity gene that was found in mice. And so it's just called OB because obesity. And it's a small gene on chromosome 6. And in mice, having this gene sort of activated or deactivated can affect body mass. So I don't know how much we go into that. I'm just going to do a quick flip forward and make sure I don't talk about it later. Yeah, I don't. Okay, so if you've ever seen in, usually in intro texts, when you start talking about motivation and hunger and things like that, they'll show you those really round mice that are sort of over fat, and then they're set next to other mice that are normal-sized mice. And the difference is that one of them has this obesity gene and one does not. And I believe it's because it's inactivated. And what it does is it encourages them, or it basically turns off their reception for that signal that our fat cells, our adipose tissue puts out that says you don't need to eat more, that kind of turns our appetite down. And they're just not sensitive to it. So they build up fat and continue eating. Yep.
Do you know if this gene is dominant in the pair or is it recessive?
I don't know. I don't know for sure, but my thought would be that it's probably recessive, but it might actually just be, I'm trying to remember what the term is, where it's not a straight dominant or recessive. It's like if you have the one copy, you just have sort of like half the influence. So whatever that one is, I haven't taught that in a while. Yeah, where it's sort of not an all or nothing. It's like this produces receptors that react to that sort of floating around thing telling us that, yeah, we have lots of fat cells. And then they're just less sensitive to it. So you have less of a response and less of a reduction in appetite, even as you build up more fat. Yeah, that's why I was checking how much the text went into it and how much I had put in my notes. And we have literally this one line. So I'm just going off of, okay, this is what I remember from another class. But yeah, that's I believe what's going on there. And so if they can sort of turn this on and off, we can be receptive or non-receptive to those floating signals that tell us to eat less overall. And you can then have these rats, or mice, I suppose, who are eating much more than they need to, and they're storing fat a lot more than they need to because they aren't aware of the fact that they have fat stored away. Completely off the topic of what's covered in this class, there are other rodents, specifically pine martens. I don't know if anyone's familiar with those, but they're kind of like weasels. They're long rats, effectively, and they don't have the ability to store fat. So for whatever reason, they can't form fat stores. And so they eat constantly because they aren't able to go into long periods of fasting. So I worked with one when I was at an animal rehab center. So she was in the house with the lady who ran the place. And this pine marten would be active all winter, even if all of the other animals sort of slowed down and shut down for the winter. They built up lots of fat stores and slept a lot. And the pine marten would go all the time time because they lacked sort of the setup to be able to store fat, which was kind of interesting. So there are some cases where mutations have led to us not being able to store things. Mhm. Mostly with people with a high metabolism, it's more that they bias towards burning glucose longer. So like when we have those signals that tell us to switch from that fasting phase back to our like we're actively consuming phase, they would stay in the actively consuming phase for a little bit longer, and then not store stuff away as much. So they'd run and burn through a lot of glucose instead of storing it for later. At least that's my understanding of it. But I'm sure there's a lot more moving parts to it, because a lot of that ties into things like your thyroid, because it produces a lot of hormones. So I know that people can have hypo and hyperthyroidism, whether you have sort of too many or too few hormones, and it can lead you to either not be able to store fat or store too much fat. So there's so many different pathways. This is actually why a lot of research into obesity still focuses in on like, what are the genes that we can look at in mice? Because in humans, it gets so complicated. But yeah, so, okay, so that was a whole bunch of tangents in there, but that's all right. We can then talk about, okay, so we did our obesity gene. We also have a gene that's been linked to diabetes. So this would be also in mice, because again, we're focusing in on stuff that's in mice. So this gene is on chromosome 4, and it would be linked to also obesity and diabetes, because those two tend to co-occur in a lot of cases, and not just in humans, in mice as well. So this gene would be shortened to DB instead of OB. OB is the one that mostly focuses in on that fat storage, and then DB is also going to be involved in diabetes. Okay, and then here, so they're saying that this DB gene is just an insensitivity to satiety signals. So once we're full, we don't realize that we're full, so we would keep eating. And so with these genes being well studied in mice, you could type in gene OB and get tons and tons of papers, or gene DB and get tons and tons of papers. These are very well studied in rodents. And there are equivalent genes in humans, but these are very, very rare in human populations to see the same kind of mutations in humans that we do in rodents that lead to those problems. So the idea here is like, yeah, we have something that's equivalent, but it's not what's driving either obesity or diabetes in humans. So there must be some other mechanisms going on. So again, we come to that issue where, yeah, it's really frustrating that we don't necessarily know the mechanism driving it in humans. All right, and I'm not going to go into a ton of that info about sort of how the genes being active or inactive or any of that stuff in the background is going on, because we've kind of talked a little bit about it. We hand waved a little bit. I did mention that when we're having sort of populations of mice and we can control whether they have sort of the normal or the mutant versions of OB or DB, so you can breed specific strains and control these different genes. We can actually have other ways other than just breeding specific strains. The really cool part is they can use something called epigenetics, where you don't have to change the genetic sequence, but you can add stuff that will deactivate specific locations temporarily. So a lot of the research looking at obesity will look at sort of what happens to mice before you turn off a complex and after. So watching them go from normal-sized mice to obese and then back to normal again when you allow the gene to function normally again. And most of these are done, the turning on and off, through a process called methylation. And all that does is it basically binds to a specific part of the gene and makes it impossible to make a copy. And if you can't copy that gene, it's like you don't have the instruction manual to make the protein that it's supposed to produce. So we basically stick like a doorstop in the way and prevent anything from binding and being produced downstream. So that's sort of a little bit of hand waving in the background of what's going on there. And the text goes into a lot more information here, but I'm just going to keep it kind of higher level because it's not as essential to understanding it. Okay, so of course, if we're going to talk about obesity, then one of the next topics that always comes up is dieting and sort of overcoming obesity, or however they want to phrase it. And in order to discuss this, we want to talk about a couple of different terms that are going to help us understand what's going on. So the first of these is basal metabolism. So this is just our baseline. This is the energy that's required to fuel our brain and the other organs in our body to maintain our standard body temperature. So this is like our body at idling. So how much energy do we need to learn, or how much energy do we need to burn? What is our metabolism? How much are we processing just to be conscious and functioning? And that will go up or down depending. And we talked earlier about a set point. And we had mentioned our set point referring to anything that homeostasis works on. So we have sort of that ideal point. And when we look at set point for weight, we have a particular weight that our body tends to sit around. And so if you've ever tried to either gain or lose weight, you might find that your body tends to sit somewhere in a range of, say, plus or minus like 5 pounds. And no matter how much your diet changes, no matter how much you change your activities, you kind of stick at that point. So it's kind of like you're trying to push a stone out of a valley. And anytime you push it in either direction, it's going to roll back to that baseline. It's going to go back to that set point. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to move that set point. And our metabolism will actually adjust according to all of those processes we talked about last time with we have fat stores and we know how much fat we have stored away, and we're hungry at particular times, and our longer term signals tell us that we should eat this much. Those all adjust to keep our body where it is and where it's comfortable. Because again, our body likes to be at equilibrium. We like to be at balance, and we don't like to move. So in order to sort of get past that, in order to move beyond our initial weight, whether it's gaining or losing, we're going to have to make some changes. And so most of the time, I'm just double checking that what I've said on the slide here. Yes, okay. So most of the time we're going to end up going back to where we started from. So this is why most diets don't work. This is why most intents to change our standard weight don't tend to work. It's because our body is working against us. So if we're going to change this, it has to be sort of a consistent thing, and we have to accept that our body's going to fight against it for quite a while. So most diets end up just focusing on sort of one aspect or another. So if you're just dieting, then you're just changing how much you're eating. But if we think about it in terms of some of those signals that we mentioned before, say you decide to eat less because you want to lose weight. Well, the less that you eat, the more your body is going to signal that you're hungry, which might drive you to start eating more to get you back to where you were. Or if you want to gain weight, maybe you're underweight and you're trying to get to a healthier weight. So maybe you start eating more, but as you start storing some fat away, your body tells you that you're no longer hungry, and you get those longer term satiety signals, which tell you not to eat. So you find it harder and harder to eat because your body is never hungry. So we kind of have to work against those in both directions in order to make any kind of shift. Okay. Just double checking what else I wanted to say here. with a lot of this that's going on, so just changing your diet doesn't necessarily work. Changing your exercise habits tends to be a little bit more effective because then you're changing sort of your base metabolism, right? So the more that your body is doing, the more that you're actively sort of interacting with the world, the more energy that you're burning, then the more you're going to pull from those stores that you already have. Because you're going to be exercising during that fasting period, you don't hopefully eat and exercise at the same time. So you would have to be burning those stored sort of resources, which is what you're going for usually when you're exercising to lose weight. But again, we're going to have that issue where if you sort of burn too much, then your body's going to tell you that you're hungry and you're going to eat more. And yeah. Yep. It's actually a little bit of both. So there's a lot of factors that can be involved, and development is a huge one. So depending on what stage of your life you're in, your sort of set point is going to change dramatically. So you probably noticed that when you were in high school, you were a particular weight. And then when you started university, you start shifting a little bit. And that's usually because as you leave puberty and get into adulthood, all of your sort of internal states shift a little bit. So your basal metabolism changes, your set point will change. And then there's also the combination of lifestyle changes as well, because maybe in high school you were participating in sports and extracurriculars, so you were more active, but in university you're forced to be a lot more sedentary. So there's also sort of lifestyle changes that push that as well. So we can have sort of this double whammy of both, where because I know for myself, I used to have a very high metabolism, and then I went into my PhD and I spent like 11 years at a computer. So then it changed a lot. So my lifestyle changed, so my basal metabolism changed, my set point changed. So it's kind of a combination of all of those. And that's why when people talk about dieting alone is rarely effective. And honestly, even exercise alone is rarely effective. You need both, and it has to be sort of a whole lifestyle overhaul where you have to change your sort of metabolism yourself. So how much are you burning daily? So more activity means more burning, but then you also have to be aware of what you're eating and when you're eating it in order to kind of trick your body to settling into a new set point. And so these set points aren't like permanently set. It's sort of, this is what works right now with our current composition, and it resists change. But if you can push it far enough in one direction or another, so if you are someone who is underweight and you can gain enough weight and find sort of a healthy balance there, you'll establish a new set point. Or if you're overweight and you sort of push yourself to a lesser weight and find a new healthy balance, you will establish a new set point there. And what the last point on the slide here is talking about is with a lot of people who are obese, there's this big push for them to go from whatever size they are to a normal, healthy range. But in reality, that's a very large and difficult task, especially sort of the more extreme the case is. So instead, it would be better to focus on a goal of, say, 10% weight reduction. So instead of, you need to lose 200 pounds in order to be a normal BMI, it would be, okay, well, try and focus on getting down 10%. And then once you hit that new set point, maybe go for another 10%. But instead of trying it all at once, focusing on actual manageable goals. And that's because of that set point and the resistance, and it is very, very hard to overcome that. So if you've ever watched any of those shows, like on TLC, they do The Biggest Loser. And so there are people who drop hundreds of pounds by exercising and eating healthier. But if they ever follow up on those people, a lot of them end up going back, maybe not all the way to where they were, but pretty close. because it's very not, or it's very unsustainable to try and maintain such a large change over a long period of time. So smaller nudges are a lot better and healthier. And it can help with all of those health problems. It can drop your risk of sort of disease and diabetes and all of those things. But especially with weight loss, the thing that people don't necessarily talk about, so you always see those magazines or advertisements that are like, oh, lose 20 pounds in your first 14 days. You have to be careful how much fat you lose or how much weight you lose, because we store a lot of toxins in our fat. A lot of things are fat soluble, so they end up being stored in those adipose tissues. And so if you burn too much, it can actually be unhealthy and it can overwhelm your body. So that's another reason for sort of a gradual process. Not only is it easier to overcome, but it's better for your health. Mhm. Yeah, because it can be extreme. And if you're not careful, because our body will prioritize burning those fat stores, but under situations of like extreme stress, when we're moving too quickly, it can start burning muscle instead. So a lot of people will accidentally start losing muscle mass because the body is just taking what it can get. So it can lead to a lot of other problems as well. Like it's such a complex system, and it's one of those reasons why the more I teach about it, the more I'm concerned about sort of the dieting culture and the idea of sort of pushing people to try and lose as quickly as possible, however they can, because it's not sustainable, it's not healthy, and mostly it ends up backfiring on people. So it's kind of a big thing. But man, today is the day of hopping off topic. I guess it's good because we don't have too many slides to fill. So there are worse things that we could be doing. Okay, so I guess most of what comes on the next slide is probably going to tie into stuff that we've already kind of chatted about. So we do have some very drastic weight loss interventions, but most of the time, no matter what they call it, no matter how they sort of frame it, most dieting approaches are some kinds of dietary restriction. So some kind of reduced caloric intake, whether they get you to focus on reducing proteins or carbs or whatever. Most of those systems are getting you to be aware of what you're intaking and intaking less. There are some like intense options of this. So instead of just focusing on don't eat a lot and eat these specific things and be aware or count your calories or track these things, there are also sort of the more extreme versions of sometimes people will go so far as having their jaws wired shut or surgically reducing their stomach's capacity or getting liposuction to reduce their overall body fat levels. So those are pretty intense, but also still very popular because we focus a lot on appearance in society.
There's also kind of like a diet craze right now where people will just drink water for 72 hours, so 3 days no food. So it's a little bit extreme.
Yeah, because at least when your stomach is full, it can get rid of some of those temporary things. But the problem with those, and again, I don't know if it goes into it in the text, but with stuff like that, what you do is you push your body into like emergency mode. So whenever we're faced with really high stress, our body can kick into sort of protective mode. And when you do that, you will temporarily lose a lot of weight because you're not taking anything in. So you will burn off fat stores. But then your body is prepared for the fact that you are starving and will prioritize storing fat than burning stuff actively as you're eating it. So in the long run, you can actually push your set point further in the opposite direction because you start prioritizing storing fat, which is not what people want. Mm-hmm.
actively eating. It's just like I'm not focused on eating, so I tend to miss meals. And then when I'm done with it, like I've been eating a lot, like a lot. Suddenly, I'm like one meal a day and then 3 meals a day.
Yeah.
And those 3 meals is not very focused. So I'm like, okay.
Yeah, and it's your body getting you back to your comfort level. You're rebalancing. There's also, so things like midterms cause a long-term stress response. And when we're stressed, we're more in that fight or flight response instead of our feed and breed side of things. So when we're in long-term chronic stress, you tend to have stomach issues, you tend not to be hungry, and you tend to feel nauseous more often, so you're less likely to eat. So it's kind of like this whole system where our bodies don't do well with stressful situations. But yeah, there's so many different aspects that come into this, which is why this is such an interesting topic. Okay. So we spend lots, or the text spends lots of time talking about sort of all sorts of different issues. Most of the things that have been proclaimed as helpful for weight loss and all of that, most of them aren't really that effective. And if we think about it critically as scientists who have been shown sort of the scientific method and how we should approach, say, experimental work, if you start looking at some of the, say, claims associated with dieting pills, you can start asking some critical questions like, okay, so they claim that people can lose up to this many pounds. Okay, does that mean that just one person did that and that's now their sort of gold standard? What was the average? What was the overall? What did the data look like? How many people were they working with? Who conducted this research, or was it done internally? And that's one of the biggest problems that I have, at least as someone who enjoys statistics and likes numbers now, where a lot of those things aren't done through the scientific method. It's not an officially published article. It's not anything that's been sort of set up and run properly. So we're just getting whatever they think is going to sell their product. So we end up with a lot of things that are saying, oh yeah, this is a great solution for weight loss, but it might cause other problems. Or maybe it only works for people who also have some other thing going on. So we're not getting the full picture. And we kind of have to consider that a lot of those ads and headlines are coming from people who are trying to sell something rather than someone who is an objective third party, someone who's just doing the science or trying to report a factual result. So just something to keep in mind. There were, of course, a bunch of diet drugs in the US that have since been pulled from shelves because of this sort of lack of safety and maybe not necessarily being fully tested, or maybe not understanding some of the longer term impacts of some of them. And especially if we start thinking about things that deal with our ability to store and use fats, what else is it affecting? Because our liver is involved in fat storage. So is it damaging our liver? What about our kidneys that are filtering stuff out of our blood? What's going on? So a lot of these sort of since banned medications were pulled because of their longer term effects on the rest of our internal organs. So it's interesting how many different systems are intertwined when this happens. We also know that serotonin, one of our neurotransmitters, actually plays a role in weight control. And so when we have drugs that block serotonin reuptake, they end up reducing our carbohydrate reuptake. So if we have so carbohydrates are the ones that we break down into sugars. So anything that we would break down into sort of smaller chain sugars, that comes from carbs. And so we have cravings to eat carbs. And so eating carbs is something that makes us sort of feel good. And so serotonin would be involved in that feeling good. And so as we eat more carbs, we have more serotonin released, which then tells us to stop eating carbs. But if we leave serotonin in those or sort of in our synapses, if it's active for longer, so we block reuptake, we block the cleanup of serotonin, then we have sort of a longer, you've had enough carbs, you don't need more. So if we had higher levels of free-floating serotonin, we could reduce some of the cravings for carbs. And of course, in humans, it gets a little more complicated than that. It's there's an interaction with how much sort of already stored fats and sugars you already have will interfere with that a little bit. But overall, having more serotonin around reduces your desire to be consuming carbs, and then would reduce that increase of glucose as you break it down. But some interesting things going on. So we think that maybe if people have trouble regulating their serotonin levels, that could play a role in some different kinds of eating disorders. And it could be an important factor if you are being obese, then maybe it's because you don't have enough serotonin telling you to stop craving carbs. Perhaps. Sort of recently up and coming research, so we don't know the for sures. It very well might be. Like, depression has a lot of comorbidities, and the more I learn about it, the more it touches on absolutely everything. So individuals with depression actually feel physical pain more acutely because they're just in a state where everything hurts more. It also reduces energy levels, which assumedly would also reduce their metabolism. So that might be dropping it there. And it might be through a mechanism of serotonin, but there's so many moving parts. This is one of those things where I'm like, I wish that we had all the answers, and I kind of want to know exactly what's going on. But you'd have to start reading like papers published in the last 5 years or so to even see what they think is happening. Because a lot of this stuff, even between when I first started teaching motivation in the first year courses, stuff has changed dramatically in the last little while. So it's neat that it's sort of an up and coming field, but we also have no idea why, which is kind of cool. Oh, right. And then the last point here is that for individuals who have sort of out of control eating. So, and again, there's lots of different sources for this. So there can be, say damage to parts of the brain that tell us that we're full, or that tell us that we've eaten recently, which can lead us to eat constantly. Some of the more effective treatments in terms of psychological therapies focus on the fact that eating can be an addictive behavior. And if you treat it the same way that you would, say, a gambling addiction or a drug addiction, you actually have a lot more success than if you treat it as just a disease or sort of unrelated disorder. So it seems to function a lot with addictiveness, which might actually make sense, again, with the serotonin, because maybe it taps into that reward part of our brain. And so eating becomes rewarding, and that hence the feeding the addiction side of things. So lots and lots of possibilities here. Okay, so the next little bit is actually sort of getting away from sort of focusing on the obesity and sort of dieting side of things and going into other disorders. So specifically anorexia and bulimia and binge eating. So these are just different kinds of eating disorders. So anorexia, or anorexia nervosa for the full term, is an eating disorder. They've called it also a starving disease. But basically an individual ends up restricting their food intake in order to try and maintain a very, very low weight level. And so they specify here that for it to be classified as anorexia, it has to be at a lower weights to the point that it threatens health. When we think of people with anorexia, we think of very thin, frail-looking individuals. But if we think about what we've talked about so far with weight loss, if we think about people who have lost weight very rapidly to the point where it can cause muscle loss and damage to organs and releasing toxins that have been stored in our adipose tissue, then anorexia isn't necessarily only going to be problematic for people who are sort of too skinny to function. This can also be an issue for someone who appears on the surface to be a quote unquote normal weight, depending on how they got there. So if they were severely restricted in diet for a long period in time, even if they're still technically obese by BMI, they might qualify as anorexic because of all of those other criteria. And so that's something that I've been trying to sort of shift my perspective on, where we have those preconceived notions of what it looks like and how it is, but it isn't just sort of one type of individual who is affected by this disorder. So anytime that it ends up threatening health because of loss of weight or because of being at a lower weight than they should be, that can still fall under anorexia. We also have bulimia nervosa, or just bulimia, most commonly verbalized. Another eating disorder, and then this one is still focused on weight control, but bulimia specifically links to binging and purging behavior. So this is where an individual would eat a lot when they get hungry or when they want food, and then they feel really awful about having eaten that much because they're so concerned about their weight. So then they would throw up in order to lose all of that food before they took in all of those calories and before it could lead to them gaining weight. And so, of course, there are health risks associated with that. Same thing as having, say, long-term acid reflux. It can cause irritation of the esophagus. It can decay enamel. It can cause damage in the mouth and the throat and all of those different things. So lots of health considerations for that as well. And in a lot of these disorders, these are more common in women, but not exclusive to women. And that's sort of societal pressures that women should fit a particular ideal. But there are other individuals who are affected by this as well. And I'm just going to make sure I said all of these. Yeah, okay. And so we can continue from that idea of with bulimia where you binge and then purge. We can have a binge eating disorder, which is where individuals will frequently eat very large amounts of food in a short period of time, and they start feeling out of control. So it doesn't specify, like with bulimia, that it's followed by purging. It would just be followed by periods of feeling sort of lost, like you were out of control, that you couldn't restrict what you were eating, that you ate without any conscious input. And so that can be problematic as well. And there are lots and lots of other disorders that we can just very briefly name. Night eating disorder, so just eating at night. Pica, which is the sort of compulsory eating of like random objects that are around. Rumination is when you eat something and throw it up and then eat it again. It's a lot more common in young children, especially babies, and it takes a lot of training to get them out of that habit. I teach a little bit about that in one of my learning classes in order to try and encourage children not to do that, and it is a process. And then we also have people who are sort of have disorders about avoiding or restricting their food intake. So people who compulsory count calories or avoid certain types of food. And again, these would be considered disorders once they start causing harm or sort of unpleasantness to the individual experiencing them. So people can choose to count calories as long as it doesn't cause them distress. But if we move into the point where it's causing distress or harm to them or others, that's when we start classifying them as disorders. Okay. And then, of course, we kind of already mentioned this. So we have those social and environmental links to all of these different eating disorders, especially anorexia and bulimia, with the idea of people trying to fit a particular ideal body type. But interestingly, there also seems to be some genetic links as well. So if we look at some of our studies, our adoption and our twin studies, we do see that there are genetic links. There are sort of correlations among those who are more genetically related to one another. So it isn't just environmental. There also might be something else going on genetically. And again, we don't typically know exactly what gene or series of genes might be linked to that. When we're talking about genetic effects, we're just saying that we're seeing correlations where we would expect to, not that we've identified a particular gene, because that is very rare in humans if you haven't figured that out. And we've already kind of mentioned again that a lot of different eating disorders are typically comorbid with other psychological disorders. So we already mentioned depression is a big one. Anxiety is massive to co-occur with things like anorexia and bulimia because people would have anxiety associated with weight gain. So that can kind of compound things. And when you have comorbid disorders, you end up having to worry about treating sort of the whole picture instead of one disorder or the other. You have to consider how they affect one another. And so we also mentioned our serotonin earlier on about sort of telling us that we've had enough carbohydrates, but also if we think of serotonin and our reward system, we can also see how that might play a role in some of these disorders as well, where people maybe want that increased serotonin that comes from eating all of those foods, things that are high in carbohydrates, but they don't necessarily want to deal with the weight gain that comes with it. So that could lead to some of the other disorders. So lots of different factors there. And again, our textbook goes into a lot more details on some of these things, but we've kind of kept it at sort of higher level for most of it, and then we've kind of gone off topic and chatted a little bit for the rest. But that's what I wanted to talk about for this chapter. So we are pretty good on time today. And like I said, we're going to start chapter 8 on Thursday. So that's not going to be on the midterm. This is all that we're covering for the midterm. And in terms of, say, what kinds of things I'm going to ask about, I would focus in on the stuff that we talked about in class. I know, especially for the last chapter or two, the text goes into a lot more detail on some of the topics. I've chosen to focus in on some aspects and kind of skim over others. And when I'm making exam questions, I tend to focus on the stuff that I've focused on in class because it's familiar to me. So that can maybe inform your choice of study options. But yeah, I will leave you guys there and we'll pick up next time on Thursday.